All right, how is everybody doing? Welcome to your week one History 480 brief lecture. I will make it brief because I know you guys will only be able to stand here in my voice for so long. I wanted to do today's discussion or today's lecture on one aspect of the subject that we're getting into, which is the development, the origins of the American Empire or the United States Empire, which scholars agree begins really around the period of the Spanish-American War. Now, empire is a very loose term, and it can refer to a lot of different kinds of control. Empire can take the form of colonialism, in which a country directly takes possession of an area and finds ways to control the populace and use their resources. There are also arrangements that would be called neo-imperialism, in which the country uses economic influence or military influence to exert a more indirect control over the people in place in question. The United States has actually been both of those. We have taken colonies. We have also, for many years, been what you might call a neo-imperial power, in which we use the power of our economic and our military influence to control or attempt to control the direction and influence of other places. The American Empire, so to go to the lesson, the American Empire really begins in the 1890s, really most significantly with the Spanish-American and also the Philippine-American War, which the Philippine-American War has oftentimes been lumped in the same basket as the Spanish-American War. But the founding of this empire was really based on, there's really three elements that kind of drive the move to create this empire. There's a strategic element, that is the United States is competing with other empires, other world powers, Great Britain, Germany, France, and so forth. And so certainly strategic interest would have influenced leaders like Teddy Roosevelt. Also economic reasons. The United States was a burgeoning industrial powerhouse. We had fully expanded across the continent, and we had a very strong need to find markets for American commodities, particularly in Asia. And so there's an economic motive to the establishment of an American empire. There's also a cultural motive, meaning that when I say a cultural motive, there's a domestic motive in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and also the development of an American empire in general. And that motive was that many leaders at the turn of the century believed that war and colonialism would help solve a crisis of manliness in the United States. There was a perspective in the United States offered by people like Teddy Roosevelt, who believed that industrialism, that modern industrialism had made America a weak society. And so there was many in the United States who believed that war, that the establishment of a great power for the United States through war, could actually solve what some saw as a dilemma of manliness in the United States. So these are some of the motivating factors in why this comes about. Now, when you talk about exact events that bring about the Spanish-American War, the Cuban Revolution of 1895 was the initial spark to lead to the Spanish-American War, and then also, of course, the Philippine-American War, which is really part of that. The Cuban Revolution began in 1895, and the Spanish, who controlled the island, put it down with brute force. And they brought in a guy, his name was General Weyler, and his nickname was the Butcher. And he began organizing concentration camps, and there was a humanitarian crisis in Cuba. This humanitarian crisis in Cuba was played up in the United States by yellow journalists and yellow journalism, which is a practice of exaggerating the news, of over-accentuating the news, of creating sensationalism in the news in an effort to sell newspapers. But together, the humanitarian crisis in Cuba, as sensationalized by yellow journalists, really created a fervor in the United States between 1895 and 1898, a real fervor for many in the United States for war against Spain to stop this injustice, but also to expand the power of the United States. And so this goes on for a few years until, of course, as many of you I'm sure know, the explosion, the sinking of the Maine in the early period of 1898 really sparks the Spanish-American War. And you can see the depiction of this photo here. This is a newspaper depiction. You see the little men, they're flying through the air. This is classic yellow journalism. And the journalists in the United States did not really leave... They didn't really leave much in the way of, let's do an investigation. Instead, it was kind of a complete and total blaming of the Spanish. The Spanish were immediately blamed for this, and the United States was supposed to, just in the way that they remembered the Alamo in Texas, were to remember the Maine. And there was a real war cry in the United States at this point. Now, in reality, the explosion was caused by a faulty boiler. Almost certainly there's been dives on the Maine since, and it's almost certain that that was the cause. But at the time, very few voices were really speaking up to say that this was a legitimate possibility. And here, I know this image is not maybe the greatest, but this is an example of a yellow journalist kind of heading on a newspaper in which, you know, Roosevelt is saying it's an act of war. The headline of the newspaper clearly says it's the work of an enemy. So the reporting of the incident and the conflict overall was really building up a cry in the United States for war against Spain. Now, Teddy Roosevelt really became the leading voice for war with Spain. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during this time period. He doesn't become president, of course, until 1901, when President McKinley was assassinated. But he very much sought war. And the motivations, we can look at his motivations as a microcosm of why many others may have sought war in the United States. Teddy Roosevelt believed that the United States needed to be strong. That and this strength was in two ways. That the United States needed to be strong internationally as a world power. We had to be able to compete with Great Britain, France, Germany. We had to compete for markets, and we had to be able to influence the world in this way. He also believed that the United States was becoming weak, that industrialism was causing a weakness in American society, and he believed that that war would be a good thing for the United States, that would strengthen the men of the United States, which of course the manliness that Teddy Roosevelt was looking at was a uniquely white manliness. He believed that, you know, United States, Western European United States, Teddy Roosevelt's opinion was the highest level of civilization, and he hoped to rejuvenate American culture, because he saw it was that horrible dilemma. It was weak and it was unmanly, and he thought war and empire could change this. And so that was really the rallying cry behind this, in addition to the atrocities of the Spanish in Cuba. By contrast, the president, who you see here, this is William McKinley. President William McKinley was more reluctant for war. He was a very pious, religious president, and he was very reluctant to go to war. But McKinley ultimately makes this decision because he has such political pressure from people like Teddy Roosevelt and many Americans who were demanding war. McKinley ultimately made the decision to go to war largely because if he had not done so, it would have been political suicide. Now, the war itself, and this is a map showing the blockade of Cuba and showing the American landings in Cuba and also, of course, Puerto Rico. The Spanish-American War was a very short war. It did not last long. It lasted the summer, basically, of 1898. And it was a very interesting conflict. The United States and the Spanish were both really poorly prepared for the conflict. The Spanish did not want the conflict. They did not want to fight this war nearly as much as the Americans did, but both were horribly unprepared. The American troops in Cuba were poorly trained, and as a bit of fact, many more Americans perished from disease, mosquito-borne illness, like yellow fever, and also rancid meat, and these types of things. Many more Americans died from these types of diseases than did they die from the bayonet or a bullet of a Spaniard. So in many respects, the reason the United States won this war is because they were able to outlast the Spanish in terms of the effect of disease on their troops to some degree. That played a significant factor in this. The Spanish, of course, too, it must be said, were a very antiquated empire, very weak empire, and they were not prepared for this kind of war. And so it's a short war. What the United States does in the Caribbean, gain naval bases in Cuba and also influence over the island of Cuba, as well as, of course, Puerto Rico as a territory. But the United States also used the opportunity of war with Spain to take war on the Philippines, which was done at the order of Assistant Secretary of the Navy Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt completely overstepped his authority in ordering Admiral Dewey to attack the Spanish fleet in Manila, which it did in May of 1898, and destroyed the Spanish fleet very quickly. Motivations for this are similar to what we've been talking about already: economic imperialism. They're looking for access to Asian markets, particularly China and Japan. Strategic defense of this empire. Of course, there are the French, the Germans, and the British all have possessions in this part of Asia, and so strategic competition, strategic defense, and of course also race and a civilizing mission were apparent in the Philippines. It was a very racist conflict, and the United States justified their ability to do this on the basis of their perspective that the Philippines were somehow subhuman and not as civilized as white Western European Americans. Kind of running out of time here, but I want to take just a few more minutes and conclude this. This individual here, Emilio Aguinaldo, was the primary nationalist in the Philippines, and his story is a very sad story. Aguinaldo helped the United States defeat the Spanish. When Dewey landed in Manila Harbor during the beginning of the Philippine-American War in May of 1898, he destroyed the Spanish fleet, but didn't have any troops to actually take Manila on the ground, and so the United States did so with the help of Filipino nationalists, led particularly by Emilio Aguinaldo. However, Emilio Aguinaldo was a nationalist, and he sought independence for the Philippines, self-government and democracy for the Philippines. And when it was apparent that the United States was not going to grant this, that they were going to effectively take the position of the Spanish, Aguinaldo resisted and began fighting the Americans. When it was all told, Aguinaldo was killed, and the Philippine-American War resulted in some 60,000 Filipino deaths. American deaths were substantially less. Scholars have referred to this war as America's first Vietnam, a major war in Asia, a colonial war in Asia. You'll read about this in the Michael Hunt book. It was something that involved a great deal of civilian casualties, and the Americans very much dehumanized their opponent in their attempt to use brute force to colonize the island, which they did. And of course, as we said, this is motivated by economic goals, strategic defense, but also ideological notions of race and culture and civilization, which of course today were completely false, but Americans perceived themselves in 1900 and 1901, 1898 as the height of civilization, and what made them the height of civilization was not only their political apparatus, but also their race, their origin. Whiteness, manliness factored fundamentally into this conflict. And so the last slide, and now we're done. Whew, thank goodness. Sorry, I ran over a few minutes, but hopefully 15 minutes doesn't scare you off. This is a look at what the United States Empire looks like in 1906. And you can see the territorial possessions. In Cuba, we didn't actually colonize Cuba. We did obtain 2 naval bases in Cuba. And of course, Guantanamo we still have possession of. But we did rewrite the Cuban Constitution to basically guarantee American influence in the island. Of course, that's since changed since Fidel Castro came to power in 1959. But you can see all of the areas that the United States either landed troops in or took possession of. These Central American states down here, of course, and of course Santo Domingo, these are places we landed our troops. But these here, these are all possessions in the Pacific, and of course Puerto Rico over here was taken as a possession as well. Well, anyway, thank you. I'm sorry it ran over a little bit more, and I hope this is helpful, and we'll do another one next week. All right, have a great one.